Some basics of making a cylinder today, which is different than making a bowl or making a plate. We're going to start with a cylinder. It has the most number of techniques that would be applicable to larger pots and other forms. And so I think it's the best place to start. So if you were using this as your set, the idea that you are starting with a similar amount of clay and just trying to throw that clay into a cylinder, it will be enough for now until Thanksgiving. And it can take a long time to perfect your skills on the wheel. So best just focus on one thing right now. And then you can get crazier after that. Yeah. Any questions before I get started? I think next week we talked about having just like some time to work on these pots. So I can make a sign up if necessary for what times you want to come in and talk. We can discuss that at the end of the class, I guess, or while I'm throwing. But I think next week is a work week because it's going to take you a little while to make multiple pots. And certainly if you're going to try on the wheel, it's going to take you a couple times on the wheel to get even really comfortable with some of the basics. Okay. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to switch cameras. So you're going to be looking down on the wheel. So I'm so sorry I'll disappear, but I think it's going to be easier to explain from that angle. So just don't hesitate to speak up if something happens to the sound or you can't see me or something. All right, I think we've switched over. And I guess if you go onto speaker view, then does my little box get bigger instead of looking at all of your classmates? You may want to do that. Okay, so the pottery wheel. Welcome to the pottery wheel. It's pretty exciting. These wheels are electric. Things you want to know about them is they have these pans that go around the wheel that slide on two sides, and they kind of lock together. If they don't lock together, then you don't have them low enough on the wheel. They're getting actually stuck by some of the mechanisms. This holds all of your slurry. On every wheel, we have these things, they're called back pins. They're hard for you to see, but there's these little knobs on all four of the wheels. And so that's so that you can put on these bats that are removable, which is good for when you make pots that are too big to touch or move around. If you try and throw with these pins exposed, you're going to really hurt your hands. This goes pretty fast, and if it hits into the side of your hand, it's really going to hurt. The bats are just these flat discs. Some of them have holes drilled in them, so you can see right where that hole is. And these have these little notches on the underside, and they're two different diameters because of wheel standards or whatever. On the side of this bat, there are three little knobs right there. And then that tells you that that's the wider one. The other one has just like a single knob. The three knobs is the wider holes, and that's the one you want. And I usually put my fingers on those little things because otherwise it's hard to kind of hit it right off. So I'm holding on to those little knobs. I'm turning it over. I'm kind of feeling with my fingers where the bat pins are. And then I'm popping this down. And so this should not, it might slide like a little tick, 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 but it should not be sliding at all. And it shouldn't be bouncing up and down. If it is, maybe there's clay stuck underneath it or you're not in the right hole. Some really common tools for throwing on the wheel that you'll want. So definitely your wire tool, a sponge. As we're throwing cylinders, this wooden tool is going to be pretty helpful for you. I use the flexible metal rib more when I do bowls, but it's always nice to have it just in case. And then you need some kind of wooden tool with a point on the end that will help you clean up the bottom of the pots. And if we run into trouble with this overhead camera not being enough, then I'll switch once and just move my computer camera so you can see the side of what I'm doing instead of just the top. So I'm going to suggest that you start with about a pound or a pound and a half, depending on how big your hands are. And there's a scale inside of the studio. So this is just maybe a little bit larger than that pinch pot you first made. And you do want to wedge the clay. Wedging the clay puts the particles in sort of a spiral, and that's good for the compression on the wheel. But once you're done wedging, I always pretty much just pat it into a ball. If it's like some weird shape and you put it on the wheel head, you're just making it harder on yourself to center. And then I'm gonna smack this down right on the center of the wheel without any water and just kind of pat it down a little bit. It's really easy for this to just kind of pop off when you get started. So the basic steps for throwing are to center the clay, to open it, and then to pull up the walls. So the first thing we want to do is center. The on-off switch is on the side of the wheel, and all 3 of these wheels are made in Japan, actually, and they have 2 different directions, and you want it to be in reverse. I know you think forward, but we don't live in Japan. We live in the United States, and we use the reverse side. It's important that the wheel is spinning counterclockwise so that as you're working the clay is coming out of this hand. If you are right-handed or left-handed, it doesn't matter. This is an ambidextrous process. You're going to be using both hands equally. So don't think, oh, I'm right-handed, it has to be a certain way. Or left-handed, everything is wrong. Neither of those statements is true. So to center the clay, you go through 2 motions. The first one is I would call pushing down, and the second one is coning up. So pushing down is using this sort of fleshy part of your hand to kind of cut right across the top of the ball of clay. And I call it the karate chop. Some people put their hand flat, but I find I don't have enough space to do anything else. So I usually sit right on that edge. And what happens when you press down is that all the uncentered clay starts to shoot out to the side. You have opposing pressure between your hand and the wheel head, which means everything that's not on center becomes lumpy on the side, and that's where this hand comes into play. So again, I'm going to use this sort of semi-rigid, little bit fleshy, but pretty strong part of my hand. If you look at the rest of your hand, like everybody take a look at your hands, like bend your fingers right now. What is the most flexible part of your hand? Right, it's your fingers, and it's right at these top knuckles. But even if as I do that, you can see that this part of my hand doesn't really change shape a lot. Those bones are long. And so that's really what I'm trying to look for connecting with the clay. So as I push down here, I'm going to use this part of my hand to really come into the side and try to catch some of that bouncing clay. Now, a couple things are happening. One might be a little hard for you to see, but my elbow is really into my hip. In fact, probably both of my elbows are touching my legs. My stool is as forward and close to the wheel as possible, and so is my body. So if you're sitting really far back, then your center of gravity is away from the wheel, and you want to be kind of as close as possible. So I'm actually getting strength from my core to do this. So this isn't all happening in my hands. If you just try and use your hands, you won't like the results. You'll get pushed around a lot. But by connecting my arm to my hip, I'm a lot more steady. All that strength is coming through my spine and out my arm. So pushing down, karate chop over the top, fleshy part of my left hand, kind of holding that bounce. Now, the next move is coning up, which means I'm trying to make the diameter smaller and the ball is going to get taller. So the opposing pressure comes between my 2 hands, which means all the uncentered clay is going to shoot up on the top. Again, I'm going to use this sort of L shape right here, and I'm going to clasp around the sides. Now, a lot of people, when they're coning up, leave their hands up and just try and squeeze together. But that means there's nothing stopping the clay on the top from bouncing around. So we need to, when we cone up, we have to engage the top of the ball of clay. So even though the pressure is coming pretty hard on the sides, again, I want you to loosen up one of your hands, get it in front of your face. First, you have it flat. Now, I want you to try and drop your thumb. And when you drop your thumb, you end up making this sort of corner right here. So see if you can get a little corner between the fleshy part of your thumb and your palm. That corner must sit on the corner of the cylinder, and then your thumb goes across. So even though the majority of my pressure is coming from the sides, I'm actually putting pressure at a diagonal because of the corner of my hand and on the top because of my thumb. And then usually this thumb is just over the top to be a friend and supportive. So I'll bring those hands together and I might eventually even clasp. So my hands are starting on the wheel head and moving closer and closer together until I'm almost pinching between them. And now I have a cone. So this is called coning up. If you do not have pressure on that corner or do not bring your hands all the way together, you will get a belly button right on the top, and that will be hard to manage. It gets squishy and it keeps things off center. So I'm really going to focus on that when I'm pushing down. I've got my karate chop over the top and my side hand is holding really steady. And now I'm flattening that thing out. When you push down, you don't really want the height of this cylinder to get any smaller than about 1.5 inches. If you turn this into a pancake, it gets really hard to cone back up. You're essentially making a plate. So try not to push it so far down that you can't cone back up. So coming in from the sides, corner of my thumb, thumb over the top, coning back up. Back to a cone. So when I am ready to, when I feel like this is not wobbling, I can't really see a shake in it, I'm gonna, my moves are probably gonna be more subtle and a little bit slower perhaps. If there's a lot to do, then I'm really aggressive. If I'm really close to what I want, then I kind of ease up on it so that I don't go past center. But when you're done with this and it's totally steady and you're ready to open it, this should be in the shape of a cylinder. Right now it's still a little bit coned and it's round on the top. It should also be the diameter of the base of the pot that you want. So however wide you want the base of your pot, that's the diameter of this solid cylinder before I get started. Okay, so now it's flat on the top, has pretty flat sides, and this is about the width of my palm. That's how I measure. So if I wanted to make cups all the same size, then every time I start with that solid cylinder, I would start with the same weight. Right now I have 1.5 pounds, and then I would start with that same diameter, and I know that because I'm literally measuring it off my hands. I don't need a ruler to do that. And then I know I'm ready to open. Okay, so I'm transitioning from centering to opening the pot. If you center for more than like 15 minutes or something, like this usually takes me 3 or 4 up and down. It's going to take you 2 or 3 times as many moves. But if you're like 15 or 20 minutes centering, you've probably taken off a lot of small particles and you have only large particles left. It'll be super mushy and it flops really easily. So if you're really struggling like over and over again, and definitely don't like let it get gross and then squish it back down without wedging it, is a terrible idea. Just get a new ball of clay. You can reuse the clay from the wheel. You just probably ought to wedge it with some fresh clay to kind of mix it up a little bit. Okay, so I'm ready to open. What does that look like? That is going to be me dropping my 2 thumbs right down in the center. Usually my hands are kind of running on the sides just for steady, but I'm going to meet my thumbs right in the center. So if they're off center, they'll kind of spin around. So right in the center, hold them easy, and I plunge straight down. If you plunge down and your thumbs are in the shape of a V, then that's what the inside of that thing's going to look like. And I want a straight cylinder straight down. So I'm really going to aim my thumbs towards the center. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to open the floor of the cylinder. So right now, you know, I have just a little hole in there, and I'm going to really work on this like bottom part of the cylinder. And to do that, some people take their thumbs and then they spread them apart. That's easy when there's it's a tiny ball of clay. When it gets a little bit larger, sometimes I'll put these 2 fingers into the hole. And then what I'm doing, I'm just going to turn my hand to the side so you can see it. I kind of start to point my fingers back to my thumb and drag it open. So the tip of my finger is running parallel to the surface of the wheel head. And they change angle because if I pull this whole rim out, like I lay my whole fingers in this hole and try and pull the whole thing out, it's either going to rip off, it's going to get too thin, or it's going to be completely off center. So I want to establish the floor first by dropping my fingers in, pointing them back towards my thumb, which is running on the outside of the pot, and drawing a line parallel to the surface of the wheel head. So perhaps you can see that this got deeper and more open. What's on top is a huge ring, like a big donut of clay, but the floor is kind of open. And the section of the wall down at that corner, what's going to be the corner of the pot, is probably like a 1/2 inch. So it's not as thin as the pot really should be in the end. It's important that you establish the floor of a cylinder first before you establish the walls. Otherwise, you're going to end up throwing it off center by pulling it up and trying to widen it later. So once I have the floor open a little bit, then I run my finger back and forth from the center to the corner and back again. And this takes off any extra clay. So if I get a little clay on my finger, I'll wipe it off. If there's a ton of moisture in the bottom, then you probably want to get your sponge and kind of take that out. But compressing the floor is important so that the pots don't crack on the bottom. So we have done a lot of compression with centering, but it's really hard to get to that little core spot. So I'm literally just running my finger back and forth over the bottom to press it against the wheel head. If you do not do that, it will be easy to tell because all of the pots will form an S-shaped crack in the bottom. It's called a compression fracture. It actually means a lack of compression. So once you open the floor, you are going to run your finger back and forth over the floor to smooth it out and clean it up. Next, I need to get rid of this donut. It is really, really thick on top, and then the wall below is thinner. I set my fingers, and now I'm going to start using my left hand. And once the floor is established, I pretty much only work between like 3 and 6 o'clock. This is where the clay is running most easily out of my fingers when it's spinning. If I work over here, then the clay is running into my hands and it will jam up. If I work on both sides, the clay will get too soft and the whole thing will flop over. So you touch it in one spot, always between basically 3 and 6 o'clock, okay? So I'm gonna switch to using my left hand for a second because eventually my left hand is gonna be on the inside and my right hand is gonna be on the outside. When pots are little, I can do this with one hand. And like I said, that bottom section is about a 1/2 inch. And so I'm just gonna hold my fingers steady at that 1/2 inch. And like a pinch pot, I'm only touching the very tip of my thumb and the very tip of my middle finger. I'm gonna start at the bottom and I'm just gonna gently work my way through the donut. So the pot is still really thick, but that section has thinned out to be a little bit more even. So I'm ready to kind of go back into the bottom and do that again. When I'm ready to use two hands, then I normally throw between my middle fingers. My other fingers might be there, but they're not the ones touching. So it never gets to like 2 fingers wide. It's still only one, but you know, everybody likes a buddy. So my other fingers are there. And like, where do you put them? Like, it's not like if you're holding your hand in like really awkward positions, just like relax, back off for a second, get your hands comfortable, and then try and go back in. So now that I have kind of a wall and it's still a little bit thick, this hand is going to start in this interior corner. This one is going to start on the outside right at the wheel head, which means they're just slightly off from each other. I'm going to push in first with my outside hand and just slightly lift it until it's directly across from my middle finger on the inside of the pot. And then I'm just going to gently and slowly move up the wall of the clay. So you could see they kind of came up to the top right at the same time, because the idea is that they're directly across from each other and moving at the same rate. If you notice, it's probably hard to see, but the rim is a little bit jagged. After every pull, I do something called compressing the rim. So I have one finger on the inside, one on the outside, and one over the top. And that one over the top is just kind of gently pressing down, trying to get rid of any loose clay that's up there. And it also helps to recenter the rim if you got a little bit off center as you were pulling up. If you get any extra stuff in your hands, just clean it off. You probably will do better throwing if your hands are cleaner rather than messy. So that was compressing the rim. I'm gonna go back down to the bottom. So this outside hand is on the wheel head. The inside hand is in that bottom corner. My outside hand starts first. They're directly across from each other. And now I'm moving at a slow, consistent rate up the wall. If you move too fast as you go up, one of the things that happens is you don't actually touch the whole surface. It's like you draw a spiral. So you need to go slow enough that the entire, like at every height, the entire circumference touches your fingers. So if you pull too fast, you're going to notice that the pot is going to get this big, crazy spiral in it. And it just means slow down. So I use a little bit of water. I don't like squeeze water all over my pots, but especially when you're centering, or if you feel like it's wet and then it's dry and so your hands are kind of dragging, get a little bit of moisture on your fingers so the clay slides through smoothly. Again, I'm going to start at the bottom, really push in, gently lift up to meet my other hand, and then come up the wall. As the pot gets closer and closer to the thinness that I want, my pressure is much lighter. If you notice that there are places on the wall where some parts are thin and some parts are thick, then like the pinch pot, you adjust your pressure as that goes. So there may be a place where it's most likely you'll leave extra clay in the bottom and the top will be too thin. So I might press really hard at the bottom. I'm moving up the pot at the same rate, but by the time at the top, my pressure is different. So this is pretty good. This is a section I want. It's like 3/16. It's definitely less than 1/4 of an inch. And I think the only thing that I need to do is inside that cylinder is a little bit of a roundness to the corner. And I want that to be more 90 degrees than round because that's extra clay that's on the bottom. So I'm going to turn my finger and try and use sort of the sharpness of my bone and even of my fingernail to kind of push down into that corner. So I'm supporting on the outside, but I'm just trying to make sure that there's a nice 90-degree corner down in the bottom of that cylinder. Okay, if your pot starts to wobble a lot, the wooden rib is your friend. So my pot's not wobbling, but I'm going to show you how to use it anyways. So as soon as you start to see it shift off center, you can use the long, rigid edge of this tool right up against the wall and really press against it with the inside of the pot, like with your finger. And that will smooth off the outside. And a lot of times it takes out wobble and it takes out a little bit of, like if there's any weird thickness spots, this tool is super helpful for stabilizing and for strengthening and straightening and heightening. Like it's a great tool. Use this tool, have it available. So now I'm looking at this. So if I want this to be a mug, I'm going to make sure that this outside edge is pretty clean and comfortable and not sharp. I might also support on the outside just a little bit and bevel this interior edge without trying to widen the pot, just to make sure it has a nice flow. Maybe the last thing I do is take a little bit of a sponge and just kind of clean off the inside, any sort of junk that has built up. Before I take it off the wheel, I'm going to use one of these tools that has sort of a point on the end of it and this flat edge. And that flat edge goes from first touching the wheel head and peeling up clay, and then I'll turn it 90 degrees and kind of peel clay off the side. So if there's any extra clay left at the bottom that you don't need right away, sometimes I'll trim it up while it's wet. And you definitely need to do that if there's any kind of skirt of clay or any clay that's squished out from underneath your hands that's on the wheel head. The wheel head should be pretty clean, like right around the pot. There shouldn't be a bunch of clay out to the side. What happens is when you take the wire tool to cut this, that clay will actually interfere with the wire tool and the wire tool will lift and then you'll cut into the bottom of the pot instead of right on the wheel head. So the last thing I do is to take this point and run it directly underneath the edge of the cylinder to give it a little bit of an undercut there's actually like a shadow line there. And then that gives some place for the wire tool to slide into really easily. So you can cut it off. So when the pot is ready, then you want to clean and dry your hands. Anything that is this scale, this is 1.5 pounds, maybe up to 2 or 3 pounds, unless it's like a lot wider than it is tall. I usually pull it off the bat right away. And then that way you just keep the bat on there and throw the next pot on it. You can always take this bat off and set it to the side if your pot is too floppy or too big. But just so you know, for efficiency's sake and space in the studio and equipment and stuff, I'll take this wire tool, I push it really hard down on the surface of the wheel head and then slide the tool through. My hands are clean and dry. I'm going to gently wrap around the side of the pot, and I'm going to lift from the side where the wire tool came out. And now I can just set this off to the side on a board. But for the sake of demo, I'm going to just go ahead and cut this one open so you guys can see what it looks like. And I would encourage you to not get really married to the first pots that you make, because you're going to make better ones. If you want to know how you're doing, cutting them open and looking at the section is going to tell you a lot about that pot. So let me get this other side too, because it kind of has the whole, since I had to double cut it, it has the whole base on it. Here we go. So what I'm looking for is a flat bottom, a 90-degree corner, and an even section up to a level rim. I'm going to pause for a second, and someone should ask some questions before I do that again from a different angle, so maybe you see something different. I know this online stuff is tough.
I have a question, Martha.
Yeah.
If you leave it, if you leave the pot on the bat to dry, do you still have to run the wire through the bottom of it, like before you let it start drying?
Especially the plastic ones. I have some bats that are wooden, and I have some bats at home that are called like hydro bats that take moisture out. But usually I do slice it, and then I leave it on the bat, but you do want to cut it. If you wait long enough for the clay to release from the plastic, the top of the pot is probably too dry to trim. So you pretty much do have to cut them. And if you wait too long to cut them, like sometimes they're so wet, if you cut them, they reseal. So I'll come back in before I want to trim. So if you wait till it's leather hard and then you try and pull the wire tool through, it can be really challenging. It hurts your fingers. So if it's super mushy, you might have to wait just a little bit before you cut it. But normally I would just cut it and set it off to the side. I don't wait for the plastic to release it. It just takes too long.
Okay, thanks.
How about other questions?
I actually have one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
How much force are you putting into your arms to keep them like steady? Are you holding them? Are you very stiff, like up in your shoulder and your elbow, or are you more loose?
I first focus on the steadiness all the way from my core to the pot. So most important is that you're engaging your core muscles. So I know for guys, your center of gravity is a little bit higher in your chest, but imagine how do you engage your breath and down your spine to make that center of gravity work in your favor. So first, you must convince yourself that you are smarter and stronger than this ball of clay. And then after that, I am putting a fair amount of pressure. And when I get to over 2 or 3 pounds, I'm putting like a lot of pressure, like squeeze an orange in half pressure. You know, I think that's the most notable when I help. The two things that are most notable are the really minute hand positions, which I actually described for you verbally, but takes a little while to turn into muscle memory. That can be kind of an issue. And then pressure. Like if I set my hands on top of your hands, people are like, whoa, I had no idea that you're pressing that hard. Because it doesn't look like a lot of effort. My effort's coming from my core. But it's a fair amount of pressure when you're centering. The
Mhm.
subtleness comes in when you're throwing, when you're pulling up. You gotta like ease up. It's like a quarter, like really not that much pressure. It's much more finesse.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. How about other questions? Anybody? So like I just said, I described this for you in pretty heavy duty detail. I don't know if you took notes, but I told you like a lot of things that are really important and are step oriented. So it's not that the way I do it is the only way. There are other ways that people hold their hands or open and things like that. But I think the challenge is to get into a routine. Like try something, and then once you figure out why it works, keep trying to do that and figure out, when does it go wrong and when does it go really, really right. Any other questions before I try this again? Okay. I was thinking that we should try this from the side because that top view is kind of far away. How do we feel about that? Okay. Let me, if you don't, I'm just going to take a second to put this over here. And then I'm going to move you guys around to the front a little bit. Sorry about that noise. Okay, sorry, you're going to have to look at my belly. Here we go. Let's see. Well, we're going to go for that, okay? Just from a different angle, see if you see something different. I'll probably still explain as much, but I'll try and make it a little bit faster. Okay, so patted into ball, squished onto the bat, water on my hands. First thing I'm going to do is always pushing down. So you can see that angle of that karate chop. This hand is coming in from the side. I'm dropping this thumb. Now I have a corner to hit that corner of the pot. And then this thumb is over the top, right next to the karate chop. You can see it flattening out. Don't let it get thinner than 1.5 inches or you're going to have trouble pushing back up. So coning up, fleshy parts of my hands, dropping my thumbs to get the corner, thumbs over the top to stop the uncentered clay. So coming in from the sides, pushing up when it starts to change shape, but I can no longer easily engage the top. That means I'm lifting my hands off the wheel head and bringing them together like a clasp to get that cone. Once I have the cone, I'm ready to push back down. Push down at first. Now it's small enough to get my thumb on that corner, and the rest of my hand is steadying it. Coming back up, get my hands off the wheel head, getting into the cone. You're welcome to ask questions along the way. Last time I made you wait all the way till the end, so now is a good time to interrupt me. I start at 3 and 9 o'clock. If the ball is too big, then sometimes my arms aren't strong enough to do that, and my hands shift to like 2 and 7. That way, as the opposing pressure is like pushing back, that direction is coming straight up my arm and to my hip. So I might pull off of the 3 and 9 if the ball play is too big.
Martha, how do you stop this wheel when you want to stop it?
I think you asked me how do I stop the wheel. Could you say that just a little bit louder?
Yeah, just how do you stop the wheel when you're trying to stop it?
Okay, yeah, I forgot to mention that. That's something you can't see in the picture. Hold on just a second. So all of the wheels come with these foot pedals. So this is on the ground, and it is not like a car pedal where when you release your foot, it doesn't stop. So to make it go, right, I push down on my toe, and then if I lift my foot off, it stays. So if I want to slow it down or stop it, then I have to drop my heel, and that will stop the wheel. One thing that happens, these wheels are set up at like one particular height. I find that some people will have their foot on the wheel pedal and then they're a little bit off balance. And so they end up like putting their foot up on their toe. And that is really unsteady. Like if I'm thinking about trying to use my hip as the steadying device, if I'm up on my tippy toe, that won't work out very well. So you'll find these little wooden blocks near the wheels. And I just drop that down so my left foot is on that block. My right foot is on the wheel, and now my feet are level. So you definitely don't want to be like, if you're on your tippy toes, you're probably not very stable. And I center faster than I throw. So the wheel's going relatively fast now compared, that's as fast as it can go, unnecessary. I'm probably like 2/3 of the way down on the foot pedal for when I center, and then maybe 1/3 when I throw. If your clay is too hard, it will be very hard to center. It will hurt your wrists and it'll always feel lumpy. If it's too soft, you can center it, but you can't throw anything. The walls will flop over. So I kind of move back and forth from those two motions until I feel like there's no wobble. Okay, and then I'm going to stop at the diameter of the cylinder that relates to the base of the pot. So again, try to make the mug same size, still the size of my palm. If you get a lot of extra clay out here, you can use your tools to kind of clean it off. If there's a bunch of clay out there, your hand might be bouncing up and down on it, makes it harder to center. Okay, so I'm ready to plunge into the center. I'm just holding on to the sides. They're not really doing anything. Fingers are straight up and down, dropping straight in. I'm ready to open. So this hand is going to drop in and those fingers are going to draw a line straight back to my thumb, parallel to the wheel head. My right hand is just hanging on for good luck. It's not really doing anything. So now I have a donut sitting on top of a little bit of a base. And I'm going to put my thumbs in the inside and run them back and forth from the center to the corner 5 or 6 times. So it's smooth and clean and dry and flat. Sometimes you might pull a little bit of clay off on your finger. It's totally normal, especially if you have like a little well or a little nipple down there, you'll end up pulling it off in your finger.
Martha, I have a question. I noticed you opened like really fast, like your fingers go really, is that because when you said you were throwing, you had to like sort of match the pace of the wheel,
Mm-hmm.
So does it not matter when you're opening how fast you go?
No, when I'm opening, I'm probably still going the same speed as when I'm centering. It can be pretty fast as long as you feel like you're in control.
Okay.
So here I have the donut on top. I can actually, I don't know if this would help, but let's get a little bit closer to that. So you can kind of see that there's a little bit of an undercut in there. So when I put my finger in, you can see it really rolls underneath that donut. It's really a pretty dramatic change. And that is one of the main differences between this and throwing a bowl. We separated from making a bowl as soon as we opened the floor. Like I make a bowl, making a bowl, centering and opening is the only thing that's the same, or at least going down, opening starts to really be different. So from here, I have this big, thick donut, and underneath is about 1/2 inch. So I'm going to set my left hand at 1/2 inch. I'm not really putting pressure on the bottom because I'm not trying to thin it out, but I am putting a little pressure on the inside right now and trying to take that donut off by stretching it up. Once it's all kind of even, it's all like 1/2 inch thick, I'm really ready to make this thing taller. So when you're talking about putting that outside finger on the wheel head and undercutting, maybe you can see that a shadow line just formed on the bottom of that pot. That's because I really dug in. Now I'm lifting that outside hand. It's directly across from my inside hand. and I'm gently and slowly moving up the wall. And when I get to the top, I'm going to compress the rim. One finger on the inside, one on the outside, one over the top, just kind of rolling back and forth over those corners or any jagged clay that's up there. Starting again at the bottom. And this is a place where you can address that 90-degree corner. Like I just turned my hand a little bit. I'm going to make sure it has that 90 degrees before it gets too tall and skinny, gets hard to get back down in there. So again, on the outside, undercutting, slightly lifting directly across from the hand on the inside, gently moving up, really slow so that it can all spin in my hand. So my pressure is on, but it's even and touching all areas of the pot. So you can see the throwing rings are really, really small. They're close together. Compressing the rim on the top. And for a pot this size, this is pretty reasonable, probably in this next pull, which is maybe 3 or 4. I should be pretty close to done with this guy. It has no curves. There's no other detail. It's just straight up. Pots have the tendency to want to go out. So because of the centrifugal force of the wheel, they want to open. Cylinders want to be bowls, but you must make them a cylinder by having a little bit more force on that outside hand. So instead of thinking straight up, if you find your pots are widening, then you need to think about pulling them in towards the central axis. So remember, it's easy to pull pots out, but it's hard to pull them back in. So as you're going up, kind of pull in towards the center, So it's just slightly coned in, and then you can always stretch it. But once it's out, you have to fold it over itself to kind of even get it to be straight again. If I'm having any trouble with the sides, then I'm going to use this straight tool. So here you can see it sitting right on the wheel head. And I'm just starting at the bottom with my finger and just gently pressing against that edge. And it's taking off extra clay, making it really flat and keeping it from being off center. Compress the top. I'm going to just bevel this interior edge just a little bit so that it reads more like a mug. And then clean off any extra clay up there. Use my sponge. If there's any water in the center, I'm going to put the sponge in. If there's any jagged edges, I'm going to run the sponge over the side. And then the last step is cleaning up the base. So using this tool on that flat side, first on the wheel head, and sometimes it'll push clay up onto the side. So then I'll go up to the side of the pot and peel that off. And I just kind of go back and forth until the base of it looks nice and clean. And then the very last thing is just making sure there's a little tiny undercut right at the base for that wire tool to go through. And dry, because if they can be clean, but if they're wet, your hands will stick to the pot. Make sure that wire tool's clean, press it right on the wheel head, pull it through. Grab onto the pot gently, lift it from the side where the wire tool released, and set it off to the side. Those will dry out. If you leave them lightly draped in plastic, they'll dry out for the next day. And then I'm happy to show you at some point how to trim. So you would take this pot, turn it upside down on the wheel, and then we trim off the base with some of the metal tools that came in your kit. Pot has to be leather, hard to do that. It also has to have a level rim. So if you get to your pot and the rim is a little bit crazy, sometimes I'll trim that off so it's flat, and then that way I can turn it upside down and still trim the base. Questions from that view? What did you see there that you didn't see the first time?
So what does coning do to the clay? Does it widen the circumference?
It does change the circumference, which is good because eventually you need a particular diameter to make your pot. But what it does is it centers the clay all the way to the core. So if I was to only hold one hand position, let's say that pushing down hand position, I could be on that clay and I could get it really close, But if there's ever a tiny wobble, you're never going to make it over the point of being on center, because maybe on the inside there's an air bubble or there's a large lump of clay. And if you never change shape, then you never expose that weakness. So by changing shape, by coning up and pressing down, you're assuming clay is going from the exterior to the interior back to the exterior. So you're touching all of the clay that's on the wheel head. So one of the things is, if you're having trouble centering, if you're holding your hand in one position too long and the ball of clay is not really changing shape, but you're just cranking down on it, you're not gonna make it over the hump. You change your hand position, go the different direction, and then go back down. So if you find yourself with a ball of clay that won't center, you gotta switch your hands back and forth pretty routinely to try and discover where the problem clay is. So it's the only way to touch all of the clay, by changing its shape.
Okay.
How about any other questions?
How much, like how thick would you say is the bottom at the end?
The bottom is determined by, I think that one's only got a little sliced off. It's determined by what you want the foot to look like, right? So this is pretty even, so it could be like a flat bottom pot. If the more you want like a ring foot, the more you want to trim out of that center, like give it a pedestal, the thicker it has to be. I guess I didn't really show you that. How do you know? Like, how do you know how deep to go? At this point, I'm reading the bottom with my depth perception. So as I'm looking straight down on the pot, I'm looking at where the wheel head is, and then I'm looking at the base of the cylinder, and I'm estimating its thickness. Now that can be a little challenging until you get used to reading, like, what does a 1/4 of an inch look like? And I don't have my my needle tool. When you open that base, and you're trying to figure out how deep it is. Now, this is not the needle tool, but I'm going to use it like it is. What you do is you stick your needle tool down through the pot and poke it through the base. And it's okay when you center, like when you rub over it, that hole will kind of close back up. I run my finger down the tool and touch at the tip of the clay. And then when you pull the tool out, then you have a measurement for how thick it is. And so you know what you want the foot of your pot to look like. And then that way you're saying, okay, you're gonna lose like a 1/16 of an inch or something to the wire tool itself. Never think you keep all of the clay at the bottom. And then if it's an even section to the wall, then you've made a flat bottom pot. If this is thicker than the section, then you have enough clay there to trim in and trim a ring on it. And I don't have any in here, but there's a lot of bowls in the studio right now. So if you want to look at feet, it's a really good time to do that. Yeah, so anything that looks like it has like an edge, that has been trimmed later. It doesn't happen right away. Even flat bottom pots, I'll still trim the bottom just to compress the surface.